there's Sinton, and I'm talking to you from 73 Mania Road, Tairua, which has been in my family, this address, for about 70 years. First as a holiday mecca, and in the last 10 years as our permanent home.
And how did you get introduced to Tairua?
My first memories of Tairua are ones that have been told to me rather than ones I remember clearly, because I was a very small boy when we came here. My father came, we lived in Tairua in the mid-1940s after Dad came back from the war, and he came through this area with a truck, and he was working for a firm that did spray DDT, and so my dad worked for a number of farming families in the Hikawai Valley and around Tairua, and really liked the place. Must have stayed here working for a few days, I presume. We were living in a caravan in Tairua in those days, on a lifestyle block, while my dad built us a house, and Christmas came and we just would hook the caravan to the back of the truck and head. First year was for Tairua. It was a long trip in those days, towing a plywood caravan, many hours from Tairua to Tairua. And my own personal first memories were on the section. Prior to that, my parents had actually camped. I think Harold Corrie Wright had a motor. I don't think I know how to let people camp just over the bridge where the current children's playground is in the summer holidays, and then my parents bought the section, I think, off Harold Corrie Wright. So my own memories of as a boy camping, tent, caravan, long grass, not many families around here. The place was pretty remote. It was a magnificent place for a boy to have a holiday. We had freedom to roam that children perhaps don't have today, for a variety of other reasons.
What was the fishing like back then?
You could catch fish in the harbour, and you didn't have to go miles out to sea. Parku, of course, was still Corrie Wright owned and farmed. I remember that playing up here, the grassland was round really on the side of Parku that faces Tairua and round where the monument is, and that area around on Parku. The ocean seaward side of Parku was mostly tea tree and overgrown, but and there was no road access to Parku in those days. Early memories of Tairua, the number of logs that were strewn along the waterfront outside Mania Road. Shell roads, Mania Road, Hornsey, and those roads were all shelled. Played hell with your bare feet. And to be able to walk along the waterfront to the bridge from our place here was just about impossible at high tide because of the number of old pine trees that were lying in the estuary, which if you look at old photos of Tairua, you'll see that Corrie Wright had a lot of pine trees growing along the waterfront there. It was very difficult to walk around the waterfront from the bridge around to where the wharf is. All along that foreshore there was slabs of timber rotting in the ground, and it was very difficult to walk around there. You had to walk along the road. Sun always shone when you were a kid. Early memories of there was a camp store where I think probably the Mania restaurant is now, is part of actually what was a camp store. Pretty limited. We had to buy, there was no milk deliveries, so it was my job every day to go down and get a billy full of milk, presumably came from Corrie Wright's. The paper arrived a couple of days later. The Herald came in by bus, and once the camping grounds got really established, there was 3 really big camping grounds, perhaps more in the late 50s. There was the one where the children's playground is now. There was another campground on the foreshore where the road runs down to the school, and there was a little school there. And Ollie Spinetto had a motor camp up right at the end of the Pepe Road where that new subdivision is now. And so the Auckland Star used to be delivered by plane, and I can remember they used to drop the stars on the rugby field. Peter asked me before, did I remember planes landing on the harbour on the low tide, and I do remember one. It wasn't a tiger moth, I know that. And as small boys, we piled up sand around the wheels to try and make it difficult to fly off. It's sort of thing small boys do. But I was told that the Bisley family, Austin Bisley, actually landed a plane here more than once. Because my memories are sand flats out in front of our place and along the Menai Road were much firmer than they are today. I showed Peter a photograph of me riding a push bike out there where you'd now be ankle deep in mud, and I learned to drive a car out in front of Menai Road. I could get the Humber 80 up to about third gear. There was nobody around and you weren't affecting anybody, and the sand was hard. It's changed. We've over those years we've meddled with the harbour, with the causeway going through from the end of Menai Road to the Sandhills, and the marina. Anything you do to the harbour affects it somewhere else. And there was muddy patches. There always was muddy patches around Parku Bay, but not to the extent they are today. There's a lot more hard sand around. I remember the first causeway that we had across from the end of Menai Road to the Sandhills, and that's where the Ocean Beach Road ended at that causeway. That was put in, and a small wooden bridge I think was put in by Harold Corrie Wright to enhance the subdivision, and the bridge swept away eventually, and so for a couple of years until they raised the causeway and built a proper bridge to get to the Ocean Beach by car. You had to drive right round the main road and back through the Sandhills. Batches and people that came around in the 50s, there was early days of batches. There was always some on the low side of Ocean Beach Road, which ended about where the causeway is now. Didn't progress through the Sandhills to Parku. And they were magnificent sandhills. They were just sandhills. I think if you've seen some White's aviation photos taken from the 1950s, there's literally no growth on the sandhills at all. It was just sand. But there were batches along on the lower side, and there's a little cottage there. It's orange, flat roofed orange cottage, just not far from the end of where the causeway intersects Ocean Beach Road. And that was always referred to. My parents always called it the Brothers. And I think there were a batch that maybe the Catholic Church owned or something, because there was always Catholic priests holidaying there. Not many batches along Menai Road. The Bisley family had a garage. We had a one-room batch, you've seen in the photograph. I remember a chap, George T, who had a batch a bit further towards the rugby field from us, about where there's a little park section there now. And there's a Hapanui Road, I think, comes down from there. And George T actually eventually drowned fishing off the Tairua harbour. My world didn't extend much further than that. I remember the T family and the Bisleys. There was a lady here, a Miss McKee, who had some property around here, and the small beach batch that's on the corner of Hornsey and Mania, where they intersect going through the way. One glorious summer was the Golden Dawn tea rooms, Miss McKee's tea rooms, and she had some little one-room batches about where Bruce and Pat Gilbert finished up living. And I remember coming here one time for a holiday break, and our caravan had blown over. This was before the batch moved in, and we had to move into one of Miss McKee's little batches while Dad could find enough guys to push the caravan back on its wheels. Nothing at Pawanui. We used to go over there often, but always by boat. And there was the original people that were living there on Tairua then were the Holland family, Mr. and Mrs. Holland, and they had that little farm up against the hill. And my dad knew them. How he knew them, I don't know. And we used to walk along Tairua beach, and Dad would go up and see the Hollands, and then we'd take half a sack of undersized paua and come back with our haul. Not much in the way of fisheries regulations in those days. There was plentiful mussels on the entrance. Would have never expected that Tairua would finish up the major holiday destination that it is, and so we used to net out here, block the whole Graham's Stream off with a net, catch everything coming and going, because in those days we thought it would go on forever. What else I can remember as a child? I remember walking around to Mary Beach's shop, and my memories of Mrs. Beach is that she was running a little country store at the end of a terrible road in a remote place, and she was always immaculately dressed, always immaculately presented. And the little store was, I think it had oiled floors. It was a very distinctive smell, and she sold things like Coleman lanterns and Primuses and Primus prickers and merchandise. But I always remember her as being a very neat and tidy lady, always very friendly. And yeah, no power here, no electricity of course, so cooking for my mother was all on what we used to call a false cooker, which was a 2-ring kerosene cooker. I've got a Primus over there on the coffee table that from those days that we would have had some Primuses, and Coleman lanterns, Tilly lanterns, and we used to have keeping things cold was very difficult, must have been very difficult for my mum. We had a thing called a coolette, which was about the size of a microwave but bigger. And I've spoken to people about it since, and I'm the only person that seems to remember them. It was made out of a sort of a pumice concrete, and you poured it, the top was concave, and you poured water into it, and the water trickled down through the pumice through the sides, and theoretically kept whatever inside was cool. I don't know how effective it was, but I know we had safes, and we always had a water supply. Corrie Wright supplied water to all these sections. It required you had to have a tank because there was no pressure, but a lot of beach subdivisions like Waimataa, Waihi Beach, Pukahina, places like that through the Bay of Plenty, you had to rely on bore water or rainwater, and we were always here guaranteed that the tank would be full. Yeah, I guess Dad paid some Corrie Wright for it. He would have done it for nothing. But it was quite, it was a bit unusual for a beach subdivision in the 1950s to be supplied with basically town supplied water. Had to dig a hole for a toilet, of course, long drop dunnies. I suppose one of the things I most remember from my holidays here is just the freedom that we had. There were our neighbours on one side, we had no neighbours on the other, but people who had a batch next door to us, they came about the same time as us. It was Mr. and Mrs. Anderson from Huntley, and they had their daughter and son-in-law used to come and stay as well, big family, and their name was King, Mr. and Mrs. King. And so there was always playmates, and we were allowed an enormous amount of freedom. I think the only rule that I can remember they'd been pretty strict about was you didn't go in the water with it unless an adult was around. And we had dinghies and canoes and things, and you weren't allowed to go past where the wharf is on Parku now. But apart from that, it was just freedom to wander, do what boys do, muck about, mess about in boats. Trailer boats weren't what they are today. Dad had a boat up here, he would have dragged it up on a trailer, but not specifically a boat trailer. And then you drove out onto the estuary at low tide and dragged your boat off the trailer and just anchored it out there. So in that little channel, that's outside our place. The Andersons had a boat, the Bisleys would have had a boat, Dad, George T's boat, they were all anchored just on the little channel out there. Yeah, so if Dad came home from a fishing trip and couldn't get up the channel with the boat, he'd leave it down by the wharf or by the mill, and then I'd be dispatched to bring it back up on the high tide. I wasn't allowed to use the motor, of course. I'd have to row the damn thing up. And then if I couldn't get it right up, I'd have to anchor it and go back and get it again. But that was a bit of a hassle. The mill, I was talking about the mill, the water came right up to the door, right up to the front where the cafe is today. The high tide was right up there. It's all been reclaimed. And along with what we call the Shell Bank, which ran out from where the marina is now and ran right out into the harbour, sort of hockey shaped. It was low lying, it was covered in tussock, near tussock type plant, near the Parku, but as it ran out into the harbour, it was just shell, hard shell. And I think it was a growing thing. I think if the marina if they'd never taken the shell off it for the roads, it would now be quite a big part of the harbour out in front of us here. Yeah, but all that shell bank, a lot of it Corrie Wright took it, and he had converted the sawmill at Parku into a grip mill for grinding the stuff up. I think they also sold some of it. Does Shell produce lime or something? Is it?
Who were the important people in town then?
I remember, Mrs. Beach's shop. Really didn't, as holiday makers, I didn't get to know the locals particularly well, but obviously the Prescott family. Brian Cullen ran the bus, and I remember actually catching that bus out of Tairua. My dad was friends with a chap called Bill Lopes, or knew him quite well, and I think he knew the Laycocks. He certainly knew Harold Corrie Wright. Derek was just a young man around the farm then. So I think Dad had worked for Harold Corrie Wright when he was spraying DDT. I remember New Year's Day sports days at the footy field. I had no idea who ran them, but there was races for the kids and that sort of thing. Must have been some giveaways, I don't know, I can't remember. And prior to the picture theatre, I remember my parents going to some sort of a function at the hall, a dance. And I remember some talk about how the men we weren't allowed a beer near a dance floor, so they'd have to come out of the dance hall and go down the road and have a beer off the back of someone's truck. Yeah, so there was some social life for the campers. I think there was always a bit of campers versus locals thing. Another name, the garage was owned by Annie Bustard. It wasn't where it is now, it was further towards Corrie Wright's farm, but it was probably just further up the main road a bit. It was just a wooden place with a couple of petrol pumps, Danny Bustard, yeah. And it was until the Sweet family came along and did the BP service station. By then the place had a picture theatre, family picnic, and with another family like the Bisleys go up with Pukatui. You could drive up a little bit further than you can now. You could get past the dock camp a little bit, and there was still some buildings there. There was not buildings, there were derelict huts, big miners' cottages, and you could walk up the river a bit, and sometimes there were fruit trees where there'd been people living when the place had been a bustling little town. And we used to walk down to Tikaro. One of the Brewsters, I think Bill Brewster, and somebody bought Tikaro and pushed in a bit of a track. I think if you'd had a tractor you could have driven in, maybe a four-wheel drive. We used to walk down, and the original tombstone for the sailor that drowned there was there then, a wooden tombstone, which we visit. And the interesting thing was it was carved wooden, and I think his name was William Sampson or Simpson, and the S's are carved backwards. Someone told me that headstone is now the Naval Museum in Auckland, I don't know that. It was vandalised. So they were little, but the roads were not conducive to going very far. Once you spent 4.5 hours getting here in a truck for your summer holidays, you didn't really want to stray off on the roads again. The roads were metal all the way from Tairua, all the way. Only tar seal bits would have been through Waihi and past the rural schools. It was quite a mission. I can distinctly remember the road down from Macbeth's Quarry Road, having patches of grass in the centre of it, like a farm track. There's so little traffic. And the road out of here, we did get cars stuck in here a few times in floods. And I remember going out through Whenua and Corrigleen with a road with the fords. There was a number of fords where there's culverts now. And the ford's been quite high, and Dad sort of walking across the ford to check out what the depth was before we drove through it. And there were fords at Whenua and the other thing I'm quite sure of, and I've asked people and no one else has a memory of it, but I'm sure that where Corrigle's boundary was on the state highway going north out of Tairua on Pumpkin Hill, there was a cattle stop across the main highway. No one else seems to remember it, but I'm convinced that it was there sometime. It would have been in Corrigle's northern boundary. It would have been somewhere past the Tikara too.
What did you spend your time doing?
Playing, but a little bit of fishing. I get terribly seasick, and it probably ruined fishing for me for life, because if my dad decided to go fishing, we went for the day, and we'd be out at Slipper Island, and a puking kid was going to break into his fishing trip to bring a chundering kid back to the base, so it kind of killed it for me a bit. And I suppose my mum was doing what mums did. It would have been pretty difficult cooking 3 meals a day on a camp cooker, and we, everything, you couldn't keep anything fresh. There's no refrigeration, and later on people had generators. Most of the people we knew didn't. So yeah, what I did would be just what boys do: swimming, messing about in little boats.
And essentially you lived off the ocean, really, didn't you?
I think it certainly was supplemented our diet. I'm pretty sure that we needed some mussels. Pippies were plentiful. You could literally fill a bucket in just seconds. I mean, I know old people my age say everything was better then, but it certainly you scooped up pippies off. You didn't have to dig for them; you just scooped them into a bucket.
Yep.
I hate to say it, were plentiful. Not here in Tairua, but at Pawanui they were. To have dressings done, and finally the sister in charge of A&E said to my mother, "Go on your holiday, take the bandage off, hit the salt water. There's not many people around there," because it didn't look very nice. And honestly, it healed up very, very quickly. Yeah.
What did you do for veg and fruit and stuff?
Veggies. The camp store would have had a few. I think we ate a hell of a lot of tin food. Like on holiday, we would have had stew things out of tins. There was, I'm sure, at least one summer there was a truck came round selling fruit and veggies. I'm pretty sure.
So you got your dairy and your bread from the
shop,
veg store?
I think it was Connell's store with the camp store. Only open limited hours. That's where we got a billy of milk, and then Mum, you would have had to boil the milk, I think, and your cup of Milo always had a sort of a scummy layer on the top that wasn't all that pleasant from memory. The original batch that's in the photograph in this splashboard, that was my father owned a building removal business in Tauranga. He fortunately got out of DDT.
I can shift that stuff.
That was a railway house in Tauranga, which the room was cut off and the people didn't want the room, so Dad brought it up here as a batch. When we built this new place, we couldn't find any record of it, the TCDC at all, so it was in those days Thames County Council, and I very much doubt whether anybody Dad got a permit. and then that batch remained here. The carcass of that was what we knocked down to build this place
How did they get that here?
by truck.
Or your
Yeah.
dad's truck?
Yeah, my dad's truck. Very, very, very difficult. It was a long day. That would have come
Big
up about
shift.
1956. That would have been that was 10 feet by 20, tiny, and it would be about as big as you could have ever got through that road in those days. There was serious impediments to house moving in those days between Waihi and Whitianga. Enormous number of one-lane bridges, some of them on right-angle corners. There was also a Pūtakawa tree at a Pūteri where you had to go down through the ford to get a truck through because the tree was supposedly sacred and you couldn't chop chunks off it, which is probably and so that was the first building. Then once I'd left school and I started working in the house removal business, we came up here to do quite a bit of work. Original Tairua golf course was up on the lands and survey blocks on the Kopahekawai. And we bought a couple of small buildings over as club rooms for that, and they came from Thames. By then the Kopahekawai was open. That was a good thing. And the golf course was up on the Kopahekawai, and we bought those over in some arrangement that Dad had with was our local riding member was a chap called, I'm sure people remember, Harry Kennedy, and Harry arranged for us to pick up these two buildings in Thames, and I think they either came from the Tairua motor camp or the Tairua old people's home, and we put them up on the Lands and Survey block as club rooms for the first golf course. Then when the golf course was put in here, we brought them down from there and they formed part of the first golf buildings here. Funnily enough, I have absolutely no memory of bringing them in from the Lands and Survey block to the golf course here, but I've seen photographs in the history book of the golf club that clearly shows our truck at the golf course shifting. I have no memory of that at all. Another little building we bought, and we were working in Whangamata, and Harry Kennedy got us to bring the first library building into Tairua, which was a single room, very tiny, and it was, I think it ran as a book club. You know, it was one of those places where the door was left unlocked and you left your books, and that, we put that beside the hall. We also repiled the hall twice in my working life. The first time was probably in the late 60s, then we did it again a few years, just 19, this century anyway. Through my work, we shifted the St Francis house in from Redbridge Road. I think originally it was out there it might have been a hardware shop or something like that, or a show home. I'm not sure. That was quite a big job for its time because it was over height and all the power wires had to be lowered and things. That was one building we brought in, and there's a couple of little batches around Tairua that I recognise that I remember bringing in, but I don't remember where they came from. Once the Kopahekawai opened and the roads improved, then you could start bringing some reasonable sized buildings in.
Can you describe your sleeping and living arrangements in that original?
Right, well that little batch there had a double bed in it for my parents at one end and the rudiments of a kitchen at the other, sink bench. Of course there was no sewerage system, so the waste just went into a hole in the ground. The caravan, as you can see, was an old plywood, and the tent, one of those huge great green and white tents with leak-like sieves, and took up half the boot of the Humber 80, with great wooden poles, great cumbersome thing. I always had company here. I'm an only child, but some two children sort of grew up with us in a sort of semi-fostering arrangement, and they were always here, so I had company, and the girl was a little bit older than me, the boy was quite a bit older than me, so we would have been separated. He would have slept in the tent and I would have slept in the caravan or something like that. Can
you describe the ablutions?
Yeah, hole in the ground. and a drum full of DDT and a flip gun.
Lime for the toilet.
Yeah, no, flip gun mainly. And I remember the DDT was a pump action flip gun thing, and the DDT used to crystallise around the exit where the spray came out. So every so often you'd have to flick a great lump of dried DDT off, which killed everything, spiders, flies. It was the greatest thing since sliced bread then.
So, what did you do the washing up in? Do you have a big?
A basin.
You had a basin.
Basin or a there was a sink in there which just drained out into a hole in the ground. Yeah, it was pretty rude. I mean, it was just camping really. The fact that there was a wooden building on the site was great when the weather was dropping. Basically, it was just camping. Like,
You really only came up for a fortnight, didn't you?
we only came up for a fortnight. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of Kiwi families camped in places around the east coast, just on a farm somewhere, dug a hole in the ground, fired up the kerosene cookers, and
And they were good times.
I guess if the going got too tough, you just packed up and went home. Well, I think Dad paid something like £125 for this, and I'm always a little bit amused because when we applied for the permit for this place, I see the title was issued to Dad in 1956, but I know we were here prior to that, so I can only surmise, and this is just an assumption, that Dad bought the section of Harold Corrie Wright, and Harold Corrie Wright gave him 3 years to pay it off or something like that, because in those days developers would do that. The Holland people, Holland family, was subdivided on that basis. You could buy. I bought a section there in the Holland block. That was before Hoppers bought Tairua, and I think I had 3 years to pay it off.
Also, they had problem getting title through at times too, and there was a delay.
Yeah, I'm only a kid. I think I've only got Dad's word for that. I've no idea really. But getting back to what I said before, Olive Shepherd was the lady that marketed these sections, and she'd been the dairy factory secretary. She was quite a formidable lady, and I think she was related to the lady that owned Slipper Island and the Needhams, and of course that in those days the main part of Taranui was just a pine tree infested over, which was the runoff, I believe, for Slipper Island, and I can actually remember the barge taking sheep off and on off the point at Taranui. And Mr. and Mrs. Holland actually milked cows in their little farm up against the hill. And I think it's in that book of Bennett's that they brought their cream cans across the harbour by dinghy to the dairy factory, because there was no road access into Taranui.
So the dairy factory was here?
By the wharf somewhere, here in that area, yeah.
In the 50s?
No, I think by the time we got here the dairy factory closed.
The houses on the trucks, they were you lifted them up and backed the truck underneath them, and then and vice versa when you dropped them off, and so you could lower them down. They were manual jacks, were they?
Yeah, they were manual jack, a ratchet stumping jack from Australia, which was most building were felt on. It was heavy manual work in those days. It's subsequent, I mean, the modern gear and house moving just doesn't relate to that at all. It's not hydraulics, and it's so much safer, and it's less physically demanding. But I think the big thing is safety. It is so much safer than when I used to do it as a young fellow. So that brought us up here doing work. We site shifted a house up at Pepe for Mr. and Mrs. Hazeldine, who had owned the farm. My parents always called it Hazeldine's Corner, which is where the Marai meeting house is now. And that was a little one-way bridge there, and Mr. and Mrs. Hazeldine had farmed up there. And when they sold the farm, they must have come in Pepe Road, and the little cottage is still there. You can't see it very easily from the road, but it must have been a big section, and we shifted it so they could subdivide, I think. And so we're the houses that are there now, the little houses in the back. In those days, often when we took the building and we were transporting the gear to a remote place, because building permits could be jacked up over the phone and through the writing member and things like that. Often we'd get to a town like this and then someone would say, oh, while you're here we'll get you to do this and this and this, and so you'd come to do one job and you might be up here doing 2 or 3. And the local body in those days, counties, were much more flexible about do the job and get the building and get the inspection afterwards, you know.
Yeah.
So we did come here, getting the house removal transporter from Waihi to Tairua, to Tairua, sorry. The transporter empty was quite a mission. There was places where I had to drive the truck up the bank to get enough room to get onto the bridge, particularly the old bridge at Hikawai. Past Morrison's store was a tight right angle turner onto that long bridge over the Tairua River. And I used to have to drive the transporter, the truck, actually past the bridge and then jackknife up the bank so I could get onto the bridge. And the transporter was over width and the bridges were pretty tight. It was a bit of a mission, just with an empty trailer, let alone with a house on there. But once the Hikawai came in, that really did change Tairua, didn't it? It changed the eastern side of the Coromandel. The remoteness went, access, the farms improved because they went from cream cans to tanker supply. People started, by then the power course was well established. And so what would previously been a long trip from Auckland or Hamilton was now a pretty quick trip. So the only important thing I remember was in 1953, and my father cut his 2 weeks holiday short. We drove from here to Rotorua in a truck to stand in the racecourse at Rotorua and wave our little flags while the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen went past. And Dad took time off his annual 2 weeks leave to do that. I probably wouldn't walk to the end of Mania Road to see them nowadays. Times have changed.
Yeah.
Do you remember what time your dad would have had to leave Tairua to bring this?
That there would have been an all-day trip. There was daylight shifting in those days, and mostly now the wide loads are done at night, but that would have been a solid all day. They would have got here one day, probably got the truck out from underneath it and got the truck away back home. It would have been a big day for the driver, but of course in those days they didn't have logbooks and there was nothing like that, so he would have just driven back. And then his dad would have stayed with somebody and put the piles in. Looking at the foundations, I was talking to Peter before, that's just a joke, the foundations compared to what you've got to do today.
And who would he have met on the road coming the other way?
Not a hell of a lot. Very limited traffic in those days. You have a pilot vehicle anyway, so there would have been another vehicle out in front of the truck, out in front carrying all the gear. Probably didn't have any signs on it. Everyone's going so slowly on a metal road, you just stuck your hand out the window and told them to stop and back up into a cutting or something. There was not a lot of traffic on the roads. Very good. And you could spot them a mile off the dust.
Yeah.
The wet day wasn't so good, but on a dry day you could see them from the top of Macbeth's Hill. You could see right down to the Hikawai if anyone was coming up. It would have been a place to chill out for them. We'd take the surf caster over to Tairua and then fall asleep on the beach, you know, so after a year's work. And it has been for our family. It's been a bit of a bold.
Your mother just loved Tairua.
My mother grew up at Eastbourne in Wellington before it had road access.
Wow.
So my grandfather went to work every day in Wellington on the ferry, and my mother went to Wellington Girls College on the ferry every day. It was a primary school at Eastbourne, and I think when she hit here in 1948 or 49 or whatever, it reminded her of her childhood, because she always said I had an idyllic childhood in Eastbourne, and I think she really liked the place. But you know, one of our sons spent his university holidays here working for Wayman Builders in Wadianga. It was a good double hole for him after a year of varsity to be up here and did a summer paper as well. So it has been a place. You know, after my mum died in Tairua, a lorry who nursed her came up here for a few days just on her own, just to heal.
It's our home really, eh?
It's been a bit special. It's going to be hard to leave it one day.
Our boys, we've got 4. They love it. Our oldest boy's got his own place here.
In those days, only come up here for Christmas and maybe Easter, maybe Labour weekend, but it wasn't somewhere you came for a weekend.
Because of road access, eh?
The roads,
Yeah.
you know, it was, even when I left school, what, 1964, and started coming up here for work, the road was metal. On your time, the road was metal all the way from Waihiei to Whangatāra, I think. Yeah. So they were long trips in the truck with the dust coming up around the door, with mum and dad both smoking.
I have to say, when you first brought me up here, and I thought it was supposed to be the most magnificent place on earth, and the tide was out and it was grey, and I thought, oh, what the hell, this is, I'm going to take that on.
But she hung in there.
There's been raving about this place, and I think it's the pits, but I have changed my mind.
It wooed you.
I've changed my mind.
Very well too, by the look of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has been special for our family. We held it, and we're really lucky, because I think whatever Dad paid for this place, in later life he talked about how values had got to the extent where ordinary working folk couldn't afford to buy a waterfront section. And I think he said something like, when he bought this section, he was self-employed, but in an industry that wasn't a big earner. And I think he said if he could save all his after-tax wages, he could have bought this with 4 months' wages. He used to say, you tell me who can buy a waterfront section anywhere in New Zealand with 4 months' wages or salary today. Just impossible. So the change in waterfront here, our neighbours here, the Andersons, who I've mentioned, came from Huntley. They were railway workers. Now, railway workers weren't paid a hell of a lot in the 1940s and 50s. There was a family just down here, came a little bit later. They were plasterers and painters from Narawaki. So along the people that I knew of, or the kids I knew whose their parents were tradies, nowadays the waterfront properties are owned by professional people and businessmen. Dad would say the value got out of kilter with income. But of course we didn't get, when he bought the section he got 4 survey pegs and a water supply that he would have to pay for. The road out there on Manaia Road was shell, as we said, and there's nothing else, so he got 4 survey pegs and some long grass. And I'm very sure that Bill Anderson wouldn't have got their first batch. Next door was a series of railway huts stuck together. So it was a cheap holiday.
And that's all that could be afforded back then.
Yeah.
When you were earning about £5 a week.
It didn't make your holidays any worse.
No.
I think compare your childhood to our children's childhood, it was very similar. The freedom.
But as I referred to before, I think freedom is something that kids don't have today. I mean, we just roamed here. My dad and I, between us, bought 2 sections in the original Holland block at Tairua. And when our boys were young, we actually camped over there quite a bit on the farm, on the section. We put a shed on it because the Holland block was the first subdivision, had no restrictions on building. You just had to meet the building code. Whereas Hoppers had the different criteria that you had to build it. So we put a garage on it, hooked up the power and water, and our boys, we spent many summers over there. Then we got a bit built out there because gradually people started building brick and tile houses around us, and it didn't feel like a camping holiday anymore. But when the boys first went there was a lot of open paddocks, and someone ran horses over the back of our place at Tairua. Gradually it got more suburbanised.
You couldn't light a fire.
We used to cook over an open fire there, and the fire brigade came round one day here and told me we couldn't do that anymore.
So that was the end of the camp up.
So that was the end of the camping holidays. But, yeah, getting back to Tairua, I don't know what else I can add to that. Oh, a couple of things, I suppose. One is, when we talked before about remoteness for medical things, there was also remoteness when it came to rescue. So we've got no surf club, no Coast Guard. I can remember one occasion going around the rocks, and the men around the rocks off the entrance with ropes and life jackets, and there was a boat out off the breakers. It's a cabin boat, but of course in those days they didn't have big powerful outboard motors. They had some little Ford 10 chug inside the boat, so they had no speed, and they had to come in over the bar with it breaking, and so there's no help. So there was a few boats hanging around the point waiting for them to come through, and there were guys on the rocks, my dad included, with ropes and things, just waiting. Finally they did make a run for it, and they broached but didn't roll over, and they broached towards Pawanui, not towards the rocks. And I can actually still vision of that boat. It was a big heavy clinker, but sort of going on the face of the right way. And often off the point of Pawanui, you get two breaks. You get the break on the sandbank, then there's a gut where it doesn't break, and then it breaks on the beach, and they actually washed into the gut. So you definitely, you're on your own. If you're in trouble out there in a boat, there's no help. And George T, who had a batch down from us, in his old age, he drowned on the entrance, and Ollie Spinetto, who owned the motor camp up the Pepe, he also drowned on the entrance. There was 2 or 3 blokes drowned in a small tinny somewhere in the early 60s, late 50s maybe. Yeah, I know my dad was very, very wary of the Tairua bar. I think in recent years we've got a bit complacent with the bar, with the rescue services that are available, and the power of outboard motors. It's still, I believe, at low tide, a damn dangerous place to be in a boat.
Well, thank you for your memories and your expertise, and certainly your personalities and characters. Thank you very much.